All right, well, what's up, everyone? We got Jim Harold, the man, the paranormal podcaster, literally the paranormal podcast.
Yes. If
Uh,
you look up Paranormal Podcast, it's his podcast.
and I definitely want to get into all that stuff. Super excited to have you. Typically, and so I'll give you a little spoiler. We always jump into like where this paranormal fascination came from. But you're special because you're from our neck of the woods, and I want to ask you
Yeah.
this. Does it ever surprise you how many people you find out are from Ohio?
In terms of like people into the paranormal, there are a ton of people, and
Yes.
Yeah.
there's authors and there's speakers. It just seems to be something spooky about the place. And I grew up in a neighborhood called Slavic Village in Cleveland. And the odd thing is a lot of friends of mine from elementary school. We kind of lost touch over the years and then reconnected on social media literally decades later. And the weird thing is, okay, I'm a paranormal podcaster. Another friend of mine is an artist, but he's also does an internet horror movie show and is a host with his wife. Another two sisters we know make like different kind of artifacts and stuff, and they're all kind of Halloween themed and paranormal themed, and they sell them like out and about at different events and things. And it seems like there was something we grew up in kind of a gritty neighborhood, an industrial area right by the steel mills and stuff. And it just seems like there was something in the water that we were all fascinated with the spooky stuff. And it really does seem to be a thing. Ohio in general and the Cleveland area, there seem to be a lot of spooky folks. Even the Buckland Museum of Witchcraft is located in Cleveland. So I mean, there's just a lot of spookiness about the area. Maybe that it's just, a lot of the time it's kind of gray, it's kind of dark, it's kind of spooky, and it gives
It's a
us
strange
time.
place.
Yeah, it gives us time to contemplate the weird side of life.
I've always joked that there's nothing else to do in Ohio, so we have to like play and not make believe because we all believe in this stuff, but it's like we don't got that
Yes.
much going on, so let's tune into that kind of thing.
Yeah, and when you think about that, is kind of the most important thing. It's like somebody I was talking to yesterday. I think it was Richard Serrett who does Coast to Coast AM. He's one of the hosts over there. I was on his show, and he was saying, that these questions we talk about, what happens after we die, what happens to our loved ones, those kind of things. Are there ghosts? All these questions. It's actually like these aren't the silly things. These are the things that are eternal. If there's an afterlife, it's kind of more important than this one because it lasts a lot longer.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, some people might think it's frivolous or anything, but I think it's like the most important stuff and the most important questions. And people tend to like kind of crack on people who are interested in the paranormal.
It's true.
But, the thing is that I think time and time again, and I love science. We couldn't do what we're doing now. You used to have a satellite to do what we're doing now, and you could do it, and that's because of science. Science is great, but science doesn't have all the answers. And I think people who question and people wonder about what is beyond just the materialistic side of life, I think those, in some ways, we may get make fun of, but I think sometimes we're the smarter ones.
That's a really good
Yeah.
perspective. And what surprised me is when we started believing the bizarre and people would ask about it or it would somehow find a way to get it brought up. I was sometimes nervous because it's like I don't want it to be a butt of a joke or anything like that. But what I found more often than not is it wasn't somebody like kind of putting the nose up at us or saying, "Oh, that's no whatever." Everyone has a story.
Yes.
Like I was just
Yes,
shocked. It's like, oh, let me tell you about this one time. I'm like, whoa, this is unexpected.
that's actually the phrase I always hear. I hear people say, and these are my favorite stories because, some people, and I do believe some people are more sensitive. I believe that's a thing. But sometimes I say if somebody has 10 stories, they don't have one. It's nothing wrong with having multiple stories, but I mean, my favorite maybe is when somebody calls in and says, I don't even really believe in this stuff, but there was this one time, and then they proceed to tell you the most whacked out kind of story.
Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, I think that's what's really kind of neat. is that I think even the skeptics, even people that are skeptics, I think somewhere in the back of their mind, they're like, oh, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and they can't sleep. And they don't have to kind of put on that front. They can think, is there anything really to this? Is there something more? I think that's part of the human, excuse me, that's part of the human condition that we all wonder what lies beyond.
So where did this paranormal fascination start with you?
Well, it goes back decades. It goes back a long time. When I was a real little kid in elementary school, there was this TV show called In Search of with Leonard Nimoy. And I loved that show growing up. I couldn't get enough of it. I would go to the school library and I'd hope that they'd have books on ghosts and stuff. And I'd go to the regular library and they would have a little section, but it was never enough. Loved Unsolved Mysteries. That went on to, Art Bell and Coast to Coast AM. And I was always fascinated by the topic. Every time I'd go into, when bookstores were more a thing, I would always go right to that section. And I'd gone to school for broadcasting and graduated from college, but ended up working on the business side. And quite a few years had passed. And I had a wife and 2 kids. And it's not like I could start all over and start working at a radio or TV station down in Paducah or something. So I heard about this thing called podcasting. In 2005, I heard about it. It really started in 2004. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to start a paranormal podcast because I love broadcasting. I'm kind of bummed that I couldn't end up doing it for my job. But I'll do this as a hobby. It'll be a fun little hobby. And the cool thing about it is I'll interview people about the paranormal. And it'll be neat because, I'll do this show for about 6 months and I'll have it all figured out. I'll understand it all. And not so much, guys. July will be 19 years I've been podcasting. And I have more questions than I had when I started.
You were just on the ground floor, just right when it started.
Yeah, I mean, there were other shows. I mean, what I always say, the Paranormal Podcast, as far as I can tell, and if I'm wrong, somebody correct me, is the longest continuous running paranormal podcast on the internet right now. But there were people before me, and I think there was this old site called Podcast Alley, and I remember looking at that, and I saw there were a few other paranormal-oriented podcasts, but strangely enough, nobody had the name Paranormal Podcast yet. And I thought, man, how am I going to compete? And now I laugh because there's literally thousands of paranormal podcasts.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was really early days. And it's funny, I always kind of laugh because you were talking about when you started your show and stuff, what people would say. When I started, I'd say, I'm doing a podcast. And they'd be like, a pod what? What is a podcast? Why would you do that? Nobody knows what a podcast was. And now it's the opposite. It's like, podcast. Yeah. Everybody has a podcast. So, but I'm still very happy. I'm very blessed. The listeners have been great. The reception has been great. And the thing is that the cool thing is my Campfire show, Jim Harold's Campfire, which is my main show, the one that people really gravitate to, even though we do the paranormal podcast still. The weird thing is, guys, and I'm sure you experience the same thing, no matter how many stories I hear, I always hear something new. Something, at this point, I've recorded thousands of stories. Mm-hmm. And just yesterday, we were recording something, and a lady had a strange case of her grandfather visiting her, but in a sinister way. And it tied into a lot of different family stuff, which we'll get into on the show. But the thing was, I had never heard a story quite like it. And that's after literally taking thousands of these calls. There's always something new. There's always something to learn and a new experience to hear about. And I'm very honored that people want to share their experiences with me.
Yeah. I mean, so many people listen to Campfire. I'm a big listener of Campfire stories. We were talking about it before we started, but I'm a big fan of the Campfire.
It's funny. It's funny to hear you say about how am I going to compete, because I come from the marketing world and specifically SEO. And then like the paranormal podcast, I'm like, did this guy know that he picked like the perfect name you could have possibly picked?
Well, the truth is that I just thought, okay, it's a podcast. See, now the guidance is never put podcast in your title, which I understand. But back then, nobody knew what the hell we were doing. We were just kind of, in a way, we were kind of all making it up as we went along. So I'm like, okay, it's a show about the paranormal. It's a podcast about paranormal. Podcast about the paranormal. What do you call it? Paranormal podcast. There you go. Now, so I'm not really the sharpest knife in the drawer. I was just, lucky nobody else had taken it, actually. And the other thing is that when I talk about paranormal, I think it's a little different than what people now think about the paranormal. Because to me, when I grew up, I used In Search of as an example. They would talk about ghosts, of course. That's what most people think about when they think about the paranormal. They talk about UFOs. They talk about cryptic creatures. They talk about, all kinds of weird stuff, strange disappearances, all these different things. And to me, when I thought of the word paranormal, that's what I thought of, all of it. Now, I think mainly because of the TV shows, when somebody says paranormal, people go, oh, yeah, ghosts. And it's like, yeah, ghosts plus a lot of other stuff, too, at least in my definition of it, the classic definition.
Is there a particular sector of that? Because I get what you mean when you got ghost adventures, taps, ghost hunters, things like that. It's what people think of. But if you kind of lay out there like ghosts, cryptid creatures, aliens, I'm assuming you enjoy all of them. But if someone calls in and they're like, "Hey, I have a story," and your brain categorizes it in one of those three, or maybe one that time slip or something like that. Is there one that you particularly find fascinating, or your ears kind of perk up a little bit
I
at?
can't really answer this.
Well, a couple things. One, I love the head scratchers.
Yes,
Those
I
are
was
the
gonna
ones
say,
that like
yes.
totally defy a category. Um, the time slips are a great one. The time slips. I do, though, the subject matter that I gravitate the most towards is the afterlife. Because you think about it, not everybody's going to see a ghost. Now, it does tie into the ghosts, but not everyone's going to see a ghost. Not everyone's going to see a UFO. Not everybody's going to see a cryptid or Bigfoot. But everybody is going to go through the death process. Now, if you believe, as I do, that we go on and our soul goes on and so forth, I mean, that's one thing. Some people are atheists or materialists and believe, hey, if you're lucky, you get 70, you take the big dirt nap and it's all over. And but they've still got to go through it too, right? So it's truly the one universal subject. And if you answer that question, you answer so many other questions that we talk about with these different things. So to me, that's death is the greatest mystery.
I just listened to the Campfire where you talked about I think your mother-in-law, right? Where she saw the Mary, or you saw your mom, your wife
My
saw the Mary.
wife.
That
Yeah.
was such an interesting story. It brought the idea of death, and I think you're right. It's just very fascinating to what could be out there.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
just sorry, go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
You just celebrated 15 years, right? In April, was it? For the campfire?
15 years for Campfire. Yeah. What happened was I started Start Paranormal Podcast in 2005. And then 1 week in 2009, I didn't have a guest. And I'm like, well, what am I going to do for a show? And I'm like, oh, it'll be kind of fun if we do some stories from some callers. And it just, for some reason, it seemed to click. And I thought, again, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I'm like, this is a different show. And so that's when I started Campfire. And honestly, if I had not started Campfire, I would not be sitting here with you today, because as much as a certain segment enjoy the paranormal podcast and like the interviews and things, people love the stories. They love the stories. And what I've tried to do is create a place, I'm not going to sit in judgment of people. I'm not going to debate them and say, are you sure you really saw that? Basically, what my role is to act as a facilitator and to provide a comfortable environment where people can share their personal stories of the supernatural. And I always say it's the whole continuum. There's really scary ones. There's really sweet ones. There's ones that kind of show the good and some that show the bad. And that's why I think the paranormal and the supernatural is like a continuum. It's just like our life here. There's good entities and there's not so good entities, in my opinion, at least. I believe that evil is real. And there's happy things that happen and there's sad things. So someone who tunes in who says, well, I want every story to be terrifying. That's not what I do because I take them as they come. But I want every story to be positive and uplifting and happy. Well, that's not what I do either. I try to reflect the reality that comes to me through the callers and whatever they bring to the table.
Well, I think it's the relatability of it too. Like an expert is amazing to get information, but it's that, because we do topics and listener submissions. We tell the stories, they're not phone calls. But I mean, we'll do like the tired ones, like a Roswell or like the Kelly Hopkinsville goblins, things like that. But people
Right.
always tell us it's that random haunting in Phoenix by that 31-year-old mom that had that shadow figure in her room. That's the one.
Yeah.
I want more of that,
Yeah. Yeah. No, people love that because they can relate to it. And, you can hear people when they call in, sometimes they're a little nervous, a little apprehensive, and people pick up on that. And I got to say, over the years, I think the number of people who have tried to scam me or pull the wool over my eyes or just kind of outright make something up, I could probably count it on one hand. I think the vast majority of people who are calling in are being sincere and so forth. And I take them at their word. Now, is every single case truly paranormal? I can't say that, but I think that many of them are. And I think some of the cases, guys, come down to this. Either it's paranormal or the person's lying.
Yeah.
Or they're mistaken. And I don't think they're all lying. I don't think many of them are lying. I think they're telling the truth. And I find that's the thing that really surprised me too, is the sincerity of the callers. It's not a lot of people calling in with a goof. It's very rare. People just seem to be extremely sincere.
I think that's a really healthy approach, and just overall, because you don't want to start assuming people are lying. I mean, that's not good for you. It's not good for the listeners.
No.
Have you had a case though where you, as soon as they started, whether it's their tone or just the content, where you're like, I'm not going to call this person out, but
I had two that I come to mind. One guy was using like a Howard Stern catchphrase throughout his whole call, and I knew what he was doing, but I just kind of like, that's interesting. What happened next? And I just didn't use a call. And it's like, okay, I get it. Yeah. And then the other one was this lady. And one thing that I'll ask people, and I try to ask, is not to read, because unfortunately, when you read a story, most people who are not trained actors sound like they're reading a story.
Yeah.
I said, if you want notes, that's great. Maybe just put some bullet points or something together, but don't read. And this woman was literally reading. And I ask people to keep their stories within 10 minutes so we can get a lot of different people. Our show's 90 minutes every week, so we can get 8 to 10 callers on a show. And she was just reading along. And then I'm talking to her. I'm like, excuse me. She was not listening to a word I said. And then she screams to somebody in the other room, can you go out and get my book? My other book? And it's like, are you reading these from a book? Not like a book like a book you purchased or something? And it went on for about 20 minutes. And I was just like, okay, well, thank you for your time. Have a good night.
That's so funny.
But that's like, those are two that I can think of in
15 years. Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Which also, just because you mentioned this a few minutes ago, it is miraculous that you went 4 years before you had an open week with the Paranormal podcast.
Too.
Like 4 years.
Well, I wasn't every single week though. I kind of was a little dodgy at the beginning, because I'll tell you what happened between 2005 and 2008. I put out the show, but I wasn't absolutely as regular as I should be, and I had gotten a job with a big 3-letter radio company. You would recognize the name. Well, it was CBS. What am I talking about? It was CBS Radio. And I thought it was going to be the job. I thought, oh, this is the one that's going to catapult me to success, and it was kind of a quasi management job. Well, it was on paper, it was management. It was the truth was a little different. But the point is that I worked there for a few months. Great people, great experience, but I realized this is not going to be the career. And at that point, I had not made that pivot in my mind that podcasting was going to be my career. But the funny thing that happened, guys, was I was kind of, like I said, I wasn't every single week with a podcast. I kept getting emails. When's the next podcast coming out? When's the next podcast coming out? And it's like, wait a minute. I'm over here in my day job beating my head against the wall. And on this side thing that I'm not paying nearly enough attention to, people are consistently saying, we want more, we want more. And it's like, what if I gave it 6 consistent months where I never missed a week? And then like that 6th month, like out of blue, I got contacted by an ad company and I think it was Audible or something, wanted to sponsor the show. I considered that, talk about paranormal. I considered, because I specifically told my wife, 6 months. I considered that a sign from the universe. It's kind of an odd sign, but I said, there's something here. And the cool thing about this, the whole time while it kind of became my job, over time, I went full-time in 2012. The point is that I never lost interest in the content.
Yeah.
I never lost interest in the subject. Yeah, it's my job. It's how I make a living for my family. But I'm still fascinated today. When that lady called in yesterday with that story about her grandfather, I was truly on the edge of my seat. What's going to happen next? What happened next? And there's not much you can say about that you do, for 19 years that still has your interest. I had Dustin Perry on the show a couple weeks ago from Ghost Hunters on the Paranormal podcast. And I was fascinated. And there were a couple points he brought up that I had never even thought about. For example, he said he thinks many times that ghosts may be kind of tourists. So, for example, if you live in a house and you move away, let's say you lived in the house 10, 15 years, whatever, if it's a childhood house you grew up in, you'll go back and you'll be like, oh, what did they do? Oh, they painted it. I don't like that color. Well, who's to say that ghosts don't do the same thing? It's not like they're there to scare you, but they just want to see what's happened. They want to see what's changed. I don't know if he called it ghost tourism, but that was kind of the idea. I believe it was Dustin. If I'm misremembering Dustin, I'm sorry. But the point being is that it's not just a job for me. I still find the content and the concepts fascinating. And that's kind of cool to be able to have your paranormal cake and eat it too.
Yeah, I think it's good that you have this learning mentality where it's like someone in your position, not you, but someone else could be like, I know it. I know the stuff. What is this person going to teach me that I don't already know? But the paranormal is already so fascinating and there's so many different angles you can take that whenever you talk to someone new, they always have something to teach you, or even if it's not something you didn't know, but maybe an angle or perspective.
Yeah, you could easily become jaded, right?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, the thing is that exactly that. I was just on another show. It was a big show overseas, and they called me. They said they want to have an expert. And they said they'd like to book me as an expert. And I said,
that sounds stressful.
I'd love to be on. It was actually stressful, but they were very nice. But anyway, the point is that I'm glad to be on, and I was on. We recorded it actually earlier today. It's been a busy day. And the thing was, I said, though, I'm not an expert because I'm not convinced. I'm certainly not one. And I think that when it comes to this stuff, there's people who have a lot of knowledge. There's people who know the history. They know the different categorizations. They know the different theories. But is anybody really an expert? Is there an expert? It's not like there's an expert in heart surgery who can tell you specifically what to do and what the outcomes will be, or brain surgery, or astronomy, or whatever. But when it comes to the paranormal, we're all kind of seekers. So, yeah, there's people who have a lot of knowledge, and basically everything I've learned has been by doing these interviews and things. But I don't consider myself an expert, not in the least.
We regularly tell our listeners that,
We're learning.
and but also like we have like 1% of the experiences that they have.
Yeah.
I mean, the average person that submits to us has way more
Yeah.
experience than we do, and anyone can do what we're doing.
We're almost like
Anyone.
armchair coaches, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, we take it in and we put it out there, but it's really an amazing position for us to be in. I think anyone in the paranormal space. Um, I have a question, and I think this is relatable to people beyond just paranormal enthusiasts, especially kind of like the culture we're in. So you transitioned full time to podcasting in 2012. Family, steady income. What kind of advice or what kind of experiences did you have where it's like, okay, this is fun. It was a side thing. I committed to it for 6 months, but now this has to provide consistently.
Well, it turned out to be this. I mean, I was fortunate because I worked in radio for years. And it's weird because this too ties into the paranormal. Have you guys familiar with retro causality?
I feel like we talked about this with Mike, but
Okay.
You can explain it again. Even if we understand
Basically,
audience,
the idea, basically the idea is something that I do today can influence something that happened in the past. Now, that totally is mind-blowing. That makes no sense. But let me explain how it plays into my career. When I worked at radio stations, and I worked at big radio stations and small radio stations, I was very interested in how every person did their job. I was interested in how the production manager, the person who put together the commercials and the sound beds and everything, how he did his job. And I would go in and kind of hang out, probably more than I should have, staying away from my main job. But I always wanted to know how he did things. And then I would go and hang out at what they call the traffic department. And that's not like, the helicopter traffic with cars. Traffic, for people who aren't familiar with broadcasting and radio, there's the ones that handle the scheduling of the spots, the commercials, and they do the logs and all of that kind of stuff. And then I would talk to the engineers, and that was way above me, but I would talk to them about things and ask them questions. I'd talk to the business manager. I was always interested, but I'm like, Jim, you really should stick to your knitting. Why are you interested in how all these different people do their jobs? Well, here's where retro causality might come in. Suppose somehow me doing this now, resulting in me knowing back then that I would need to have all these little tidbits, because what I do, I always compare it to running a small radio station without an antenna in my backyard. So I know how to do the business side. Many times I do a lot of my advertising directly, and I work with ad agencies directly, where most podcasters have to work through a third party. I do all the advertising on Campfire is all directly sold by me to ad agencies. A lot of people don't know how to do that. But all these different things I know how to do, I got from radio. And the only reason I got it is because I was paying attention. But why was I paying attention? Because somehow, subconsciously, I knew in the future my career would depend on it. That's just my working theory. Who knows if that's true or not. But back to your point, I didn't think it was a risk at all. And I'll explain why. I had taken my time. I had laid the groundwork. I had established an LLC. I had really gone through the process. I just didn't jump because, I had a wife and 2 young kids. I couldn't just jump. And I knew what the income was. It wasn't spectacular. Even now I'm a middle class guy. But I make a decent middle class living doing what I do. I'm very thankful for that. I'd much rather do this and make a nice middle class living than be, totally bored with my job and hating what I do, even if I made more money than I do now. So I'm just like a regular middle class guy, cut my own grass, all the stuff. It's funny, we just came out with book 6, True Ghost Stories, and right before I came on, I doing some autographed books. I took a dozen books down to the post office. Not that glamorous. So you have to be willing to work hard. You've got to have a plan, and you just go after it. And that's what I've been doing for the last 12 years, you know. And it's a big job. It's a big job. I'm always busy. But I love what I do, and I'm very thankful for it. That's a long-winded way of answering that question, but that's kind of my journey.
It's a nice one.
No, I think that's great. I think that that transcends just being a podcaster, because I know out of all of our listeners, not everyone wants to be a podcaster, but I know there's many people out there that probably have that dream. And I think you did it the right way by by setting the groundwork. It's not like I'm going to quit my job
Yeah.
today and
Yeah.
you know.
And that's what I recommend to everybody, because is to find what you want to do. Now, maybe what you want to do works within the confines of working for a company. There's many people who work for companies and they're very happy. My feeling was, for me, was, you know, my dad, you know, I talked about being from that urban environment in Cleveland. My dad worked in a steel mill for 30 plus years. And then a couple of years into retirement, the company he worked for went bankrupt. They said, okay, we're not going to cover your pension. We're not going to cover your health care, those kind of things. He did end up getting most of his pension back because of the government or whatever. But the point was, those promises were made. He invested those years in the steel mill, thought he was like super secure. I'm secure because I'm working for a big company. And then at the end, they said, I'm just kidding. Where do you go back to get that time? I don't know where you go back to get that time. I don't think there's some place where they're giving you returns on your time, saying, hey, you can have these 30 plus years back because we broke our promise. So to me, and this is getting way beyond paranormal, corporate security is a fallacy, because all it takes, it doesn't matter how good you do your job, all it takes is somebody in an office somewhere looking at a spreadsheet saying, oh, that guy makes too much money, or that woman makes too much money, or we're changing our processes, or we just got bought out. So to me, job security is a myth.
No, you're right. You're right. And I think millennials
Yeah.
into Gen Z are finally discovering that. It's not, I know the job hopping is kind of intensive right now, but the idea of working for the same place for 30, 35 years and just trusting that I'll be good is kind of out the window.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's unfortunate. I know a lot of people, older people, were able to do that and worked great for them. God bless them. I have all the respect in the world for someone who can do the same thing for 30, 35 years. My gosh, what a sacrifice. But that wasn't the way for me. I didn't see that as the way for me.
I know you got a question. I
I
just want to
do.
say this really quick.
It's okay.
It's not a question, it's a statement. When you were talking about how you like built everything out and it felt like it was you were not playing radio station, but the way that we kind of say it in our word is we're playing small business. And it's like it's not risk free, but it's like it's the lowest pressure form where it's like we have an LC, we have all these responsibilities, but it's like it's a paranormal podcast. Like at the end of the day,
Right.
it's like
At the end of the day, yeah. Well, I've got a funny story about that, if you don't mind, real quick.
Yeah.
no, go
So
for it,
anyway,
man.
I had and I do want to tell you at least one spooky story from the new book, because
Yes.
That was actually my question.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay.
but you can still
Well, I'll
ask
tell
me
you the
though.
funny story. I'll tell you the funny story, then you can ask me and I'll tell it.
Okay.
So anyway, I got called for jury duty, like, I don't know, mid 2000s. And I was working for a classical music radio station at the time. And they said, juror 17, what do you do for a living? Oh, I work for a classical music station. Oh, yes, you can serve right on the jury. Please be seated and you'll be assigned to a panel. A few years later, after I started doing this full time, same thing happened. I got called again. And maybe it was 2013, 2014, something like that. And I said, I think I know how to get out of this and be 100% truthful. So anyway, they come up to me and they do juror number 17. Same guy, dressed in the same way, no different. What do you do for a living? And I really leaned into this. I said, well, ghosts and UFOs and Bigfoot. I do, I sit in my home studio and I do podcasts on them all day. And they said, well, juror 17, thank you so much for coming in. you're excused.
We're good here. We're good.
It's pretty good.
I knew it. And it's like, I'll use your bias against you. And I didn't have to waste a week. So, although I gotta say, to be honest with you, I enjoyed it the first time around. It was interesting, but once was enough.
That's amazing.
So the question, you talked about your book, Ghost Story 6. Or is it True Ghost Stories number 6?
True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire, Volume 6. Yes.
There we go. Fantastic that this is your 6th one. What's one story that you want to like highlight from this volume?
Well, this one, and I should, really, it was original sin of the book series I called True Ghost Stories, because it should be True Ghost Stories and more. But this one, this is one that doesn't quite meet. Is it one thing or is it the other? You decide. It's called The Mysterious Mrs. Raspberry. And this came to us from Jennifer in Idaho. And her friend Connie, when they were little kids, they would go out and adventure. And this was in the 80s. So, back in the 80s, no cell phones. A lot of kids would, say goodbye to mom in the morning, take their bikes, go and come back at dinner time. It's a very common thing. And that's what Jennifer said her and her friend Connie did. They were 8 or 9 years old. So one day they decided in the summer, we're going to have an adventure. There's some abandoned railroad tracks by Jennifer's house. And they ran about 4 miles out to a lake. They said, we're going to do the railroad tracks today. We're going to go out to the railroad tracks. So anyway, they say goodbye to their moms and set off, start going down the tracks, and they get into the tracks a little bit. And it's one way in, one way out. There's no other tracks, parallel tracks or nothing. Intersecting tracks is just one straight line to the lake. And they start walking. It becomes very forested for a while and a little bit spooky, a lot of woods and stuff. And then they come to this really pretty clearing. And there's some houses. And there's one house that, it's got some raspberry bushes. And there's a woman there, an older woman, maybe about 60. And she's hanging clothes up on the line. And she has what older women sometimes back in the day used to wear, a house dress, which I think was kind of going out at that time, but people still wore them, some older people. I know my grandma wore them in that era. And she was hanging up her wash, and she waved to the girls, and they struck up a conversation. Really, really nice lady, just couldn't be sweeter. And she asked Jennifer and her friend, "Hey, would you like some raspberries?" And they said, "Sure." So they kind of held out their shirts, and the woman put the raspberries like as a basket, and they put the raspberries in the shirts, and they started eating them, and they were talking to the lady. And Jennifer said they stained their shirts with the raspberry. I'm sure their moms loved that. So anyway, they say goodbye and thank you to the lady, and they walk another 3 miles to the lake, and they hang out for the lake for most of the day. It's a great day. Then they decide to come back home. And they're walking and they're walking. And they get to the point where this clearing with the houses and the lady should be. But there's a difference. There's a clearing. There's no lady, and there are no houses, and there are no raspberry bushes. And they think, that's weird. There's only one way out. There's only one way in. We went down this straight line. And then Jennifer and her friend got home. And Jennifer told her grandma what happened. She said, "Look, we met this really nice," and they knew it wasn't their imagination. They had the raspberry stains on their shirts. She said, "I met this really nice lady, and she gave us the raspberries, but then when we went back, the houses weren't there. Are there any houses there, Grandma?" She said, "Well, there aren't any houses there now, but back before the railroad tracks were built in the 1920s, there were houses there, but they were demolished when they came through with the railroad." And Jennifer talked to her friend, Connie, just a little bit before she did this campfire call as an adult, because she wanted to double check herself. She said, were there the railroad tracks, the straight path? Yes. Check. Was there the woman and the houses and the raspberries? Check. Did we take them? Check. Did we get the stains on our shirt? Check. Did we come back and it wasn't there? Check. Her friend Connie, as an adult, remembered it exactly as she did. So you tell me, is the mysterious Mrs. Raspberry, is that a ghost? Is it a time slip? Is it a parallel universe? It could be any of those three things. I don't know.
That's an incredible story.
But I believe her. I believe her.
That's a great story.
Wow. That I don't even know how I would process that. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. It happened.
There's physical evidence that it happened. That's wild.
That's one of the cases where I say there's two possibilities here. Especially since she has the affirmation of her friend Connie. Either A, it's absolutely true and she experienced something, quote, paranormal, and that might not even be the right word, but that's the best word we have for it, that or supernatural. Or she made it up. I don't believe she made it up. So there you have it. And that's the thing about when I talk with skeptics. And I was just on a podcast today with a skeptic, a very nice guy. And there's some skeptics who are, they're solid in their belief that there's nothing to all of this, but they're reasonable, and I can get along with those skeptics any day of the week. We can agree to disagree. But how do you explain it? I mean, there's two ways to explain it.
Yeah.
One, she made it up. Two, it happened, and that does not fall within the realm of any kind of science I know about. It might be science, but it might be the science of the 23rd or the 24th century.
Yeah.
I wonder if a complete skeptic would just say that maybe there was a different path. Because I mean, it would be hard for a skeptic to listen to your podcast,
Yes.
for the last 15 years and be like, liar, 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 they're doing
Yeah.
it. I mean, I guess you could say that they innocently mistook what happened. Or
Right.
because there's a difference between them being wrong, but they believe it versus just a completely fabricated lie.
Right.
And that's kind of what we try to do. It's like we only get the face value of what's told, but trying to
Right.
see, oh, maybe it was just this. But I
And
believe they believe
sometimes-
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes I do believe there's alternate explanations. So, for example, if you have someone who has one thing that happened, they think they saw a ghost. Maybe it's pareidolia. Like you see ink blots. I remember my grandma's house. I wish I had a picture of this. My grandma's house in West Virginia, she had had a roof leak. And it was above the one room that I slept in when I'd visit. And it looked like a dog lying down. I still have that in my mind's eye. I wish I had a picture of it. It looked just like a dog lying down. So I think it's true. I think where that kind of falls apart sometimes is when it's multiple things in a story. She might be wrong about this, but how could she be wrong about that? And how she could be wrong? Or things that happen, a case where you have multiple occurrences. That's where it's tougher to say that. Now, sometimes the ghost is just a leaky faucet. I believe that. I also believe, paranormal investigation teams go in with EMF meters. You're going into an old house. The electrical was probably made in the 1930s. Your EMF meters going off should not be a surprise. And I don't think that necessarily means there's a ghost. So I guess I wouldn't say, I would say in terms of generally, if you have if belief and disbelief were a gas gauge, I'd be 3/4 full.
That's a good way of putting it.
It is, yeah.
That would be me. I'm definitely on the believer side. I'm team believer, but I also think you keep an open mind, but not so open your brains fall out. So I think it's a really fine line to walk, and I get what you're saying.
So the book literally comes out today. True Ghost Stories,
Yep, it's out
volume
right now.
6. Hopefully this will be dropping relatively soon so that people, we can post about it regardless. Is it, and this isn't like a light 100-page, 12 stories. Like, is it 60? uh,
65 stories.
65.
65 stories.
How? Okay.
Jeez.
So I have a background in writing because I really apparently never wanted to make money with a job. Uh, but I'm always fascinated about people's writing process.
Right.
And this isn't just purely I have an idea, I'm going to sit down in front of my computer and write it out. These are stories that were told on your podcast, correct?
Right. Yeah, and in a way, I mean, the stories are co-authored by the callers. What I first of all, one thing that I don't do is I don't add things to the stories. If they didn't say it, I don't put it in there. These are their stories. Now, what I do is it's more of more than being an author. I'm more of an editor.
Okay.
So I clean it up for grammar. I kind of make it flow a little better. I may slightly reorder the way it's told. I will never change a date or a time or say something was 3 months later when it was a month later. I don't change details. So I try to make it very readable. And they're short stories. I mean, usually, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 pages at the largest. I think this book clocks in at, I can give you a page count here in a minute. This book is, so they're decent sized books, but they're not pamphlets. This one is about 217 pages.
It's a good size book.
So,
Very good size.
yeah. So, and the idea is what we do is we take a year or two of Campfire and then we make a list of some of our favorite stories and then distill it down and say these are our very favorite. And there's UFO stories in here. There's ghost stories in here. There's time slip stories in here. There's doppelganger stories in here. And it's not really, again, it should really be true ghost stories and more because there's a lot of and more.
So is it like when people call in, is it kind of understood, hey, down the road, your story may be used in a book format?
yeah.
Or okay,
Yes, I disclose that on the sign up form. On the
perfect.
sign up form, there is a checkbox and it says we will use this for the potentially use it for the podcast. We never promise we're going to air a story, but honestly, we air 98, 99% of
Yeah.
the stories. There's a little checkbox. And the checkbox says we may use these in derivations such as books and so forth. If they don't check the box, it doesn't go through. And some people will say, oh, well, that's kind of a gotcha. And it's like, no, I want people to understand
Right.
that we might use this in a book. And thank goodness we've never had anybody that's had an issue with it. We send free books to folks who are in the books. And to me, it's just a continuation of sharing the stories. Because there may be people who never listen to a podcast. So they're kind of, isolated in being in that podcast world as big as we think it is. And it's getting bigger all the time. Still more people don't listen to podcasts than do.
Right.
So I love the idea that we can distill down some of the best stories and share those in a different format for someone who, as long as I've been doing this, there's tons of people who have no idea who I am. They have no idea what the Campfire show is. I know that. I'm not Joe Rogan. So this is a way to expose more people to the stories and get the stories out there. And I like to think, over the years, we've heard of people passing who have had these stories. And I like to think maybe the Campfire between the books and between the podcast play a small role in like immortalizing those stories and letting them live on. And I always say this when I go to and do live talks. Tell your stories. If you have supernatural stories or just meaningful stories in your life, share them with your loved ones, share them with your family, share them with your friends, because that's how you live on. That's how those stories live on. And I think that's that oral tradition and passing those stories along. I like to think 100 years from now, when I'm dead and gone, that somebody will pick up a dusty hard drive or a dusty copy of this somewhere and read a story and say, whoa. And maybe even, if science progresses far enough, maybe they'll say something like, that guy didn't have a clue about a lot of things, but man, he was right about that. There was something to that retrocausality or fill in the blank, or near-death experiences or whatever it is, or time slips or multiple universes. I kind of, odd way hope that happens. And I won't be here to see it, but it would be kind of cool.
So essentially, it was a way to allow these stories to reach a different type of audience. When you would
Yes.
start with volume one.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
That makes a lot
And
of sense.
it's been 8 years since I've done one. I got so busy with the podcasts and everything. And then there was a lot of things going on in life with kids graduating from school and moving houses and unfortunately deaths in the family and different things. The book was the one thing that was put on the back burner. So finally, after 8 years, we put this one out. And now the plan going forward, if this is well received, is to put out a new one every year.
Awesome.
That's incredible. Jim,
And
I
we
just
have
to
about
say-
enough. I was just going to say real
No,
quick,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, is we probably right now, if I stop podcasting right now, I have enough for at least 8 more books. But go ahead. I'm
I
sorry.
believe you. No, you're great. I would say you're just such a very good speaker. You're such a compelling speaker.
Thanks. Thank
The
you.
the form submission thing is it makes me always think of we have a form on a website for people that want to submit stories, and one time, and I can't speak to the quality of the content, that's not the part I remember from this, but somebody wrote their name, where they were from, the years it happened, in a whole story.
It's a great story.
And the very last thing is, do you give us permission to use this on the podcast? And they wrote no. It's like, I don't know what to
Well,
do.
that's why I always
with
want to
it.
be upfront with people. I don't want any surprises. It would be disingenuous of me not to mention that, but it's mentioned very prominently.
Mhm.
And if that means, 10 people go to the website and only 3 sign up, that's okay, as long as they know. I want to be straight with people. I think that's the only right thing to do.
One quick episode or a story on one of your episodes I want to shout out because it's one that's been in my mind, and I realize I love cryptid stories the best for whatever reason, but I also love stories that have that gotcha, which are almost like a Hollywood twist, even if you can see it a mile away. Um, like we've covered some Women in Black stories where it's tied to the Men in Black in many different ways. But the story about the I believe it's police officers, and they saw the man with the blood on his hands, and then
Oh, yeah.
he gets picked up by an ambulance and by deputies that no one can identify, and it's just that who actually came, who is this man, where did the blood come from? I was like,
Yes.
oh my goodness.
That's in this book.
Is
That
it?
one's in this book. Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
gonna ask if it was, but I didn't,
Yeah, it's called, it's kind of, well, if you don't know the story, you don't know the significance of it, but it's called The Soft Serve Man. So if you remember the story, he lost control of his bodily functions, and the police officer drew that comparison.
Oh,
So
Yeah.
I'm sorry if anybody was eating their dinner, but anyway, it's such a compelling story, and that's another one. You've got this policeman. He's called to somebody who's jumping off of an overpass. It's basically a wild man. He's got blood all over him. These mysterious first responders come in and kind of sweep him away. He can't track who they were, and don't know. He can't figure out what's up with this mysterious guy. And then when he calls and does the research, there's no such patrol car. The state patrol that came up, there's no such car. And same with the ambulance. It's right out of the X-Files. But again, I totally believe this happened. I mean, I totally believe it happened. The guy was so super sincere, and I even contacted him years later, and he was just doubly sincere. So I really believe it's true.
It's just like the man itself is like the bizarre aspect, but then when you get into like the people take him away and there's no identification, it's just a whole nother layer, and it's just like, what do I take from this? It is wild.
And that's the thing. People want a happy ending, or they want it like a sitcom. They want it tied up. And life isn't like that in these stories. Many of them aren't like that. It kind of leaves you with a big question mark. And that's okay. I mean, I've never claimed to have answers. The only thing, guys, that I have determined over the last almost 19 years of doing these shows is I believe our existence is far stranger than we give it credit for. There's a lot more going on that we don't understand. What that is, I don't know. People will write me and say, "Oh, my house is haunted. What should I do?" And I'm like, I don't know. Call a priest. I don't know. Again, going back to that fact, there are no experts.
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of it's weird how it's like you're given a title because you have a microphone, right? Because a lot of people send us clips. What do you think this is? Or
What should I do?
or what is what should I do? What is the answer? I'm like,
All right.
well, I don't know.
And I appreciate people writing, don't get me wrong, and wanting my
Sure.
opinion. And I could say, in some cases that I've heard of or talked about on the shows, this is what. And, in some cases, I will refer them to someone. I'll get the person's permission, say, may I forward your information to this person? Would you want to communicate with them and help them? And that's about the best I can do, but I welcome the feedback. I mean, the audience has been tremendous. I mean, I owe what I do and something I really get up every day and I'm excited about. I owe that to the audience, and I'm very thankful for that.
That's amazing. Well, Jim, we appreciate your time.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a lasting note. Is there for anyone who is interested in getting more involved in the paranormal industry or the world or just podcasting in general, do you have any advice, any tips, anything that you found powerful over the years?
Go for it and be persistent. Those are the two main things. Work hard, go for it, and be persistent. The thing is that was funny because I saw something the other day that somebody posted. You should not start a podcast in 2024 if you're not a celebrity. And I thought, what BS is that? I mean, the truth is, somebody last week, I'm confident, who was not a celebrity, started a podcast that will change their life. It will either change it emotionally, it'll change it spiritually, it'll change it work-wise, it'll change it financially, it'll change it however. And to tell that person, oh, you shouldn't do that because you're not a celebrity. How audacious is that? How ridiculous is that? So if you want to do it, it's harder. I mean, I was lucky. I started early. I was in, like you said, the ground floor. That helped me enormously. If I started today, I don't know that I could replicate what I've been able to do. But you never know unless you try. And what's the Gretzky stays? Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So take that shot and go for it. Take that shot and go for it.
I think to your point, you have to accept that the barrier to entry is a little bit harder not being a celebrity. You can't just sit on a couch and just talk and people are going to flock to you. But that doesn't mean you can't break through.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Awesome, Jim. Well, do you have any?
Thank you for joining us today. This is amazing. This is honestly probably one of my, this is a bucket list. This is a bucket list for me.
Oh, well, thank you. That's very kind. Well, I hope that everybody gets to, if they haven't heard Jim Harold's Campfire, I hope they'll look it up on their favorite podcast app or YouTube, Jim Harold's Campfire. And then also they can find True Ghost Stories, Jim Harold's Campfire Volume 6. It's at Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, and all the places. And also you can find it at JimHarold.com.
I almost asked if there's an Audible version.
Well, that's funny. People want audiobooks, and I think I should do them probably. But the problem is time.
Oh, yeah. It's just funny because it's already an audio source.
Yeah, that's the thing. But people say they want it. I really should do it. I've got to get on that. Maybe I hate to use AI voices, though. But that might be one solution. That might be one solution.
You can try it out.
Happens.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate your time.
Yeah. And if you want to check out the book,
go now.
JimHarold.com.
Yeah.
JimHarold.com. There's a big green button right on the front. And I'm even doing some autographed copies too in the US. So if you want to get one of those, they're going pretty fast. I was kind of amazed. It's kind of cool. And we thank everybody. And thank you guys so much for your time. It was a lot of fun being on Believing the Bizarre.